Hi everyone, it's Wednesday Warriors and it's me, Arielle, and today I'm going to be talking about PTSD. PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder, and while it is not something that all people with eating disorders have, it is something that does come up in eating disorders, especially when talking about trauma. And we have done a 4-week rotation on trauma and relating to crisis, so it seems only relevant to have our last week focus on PTSD. Now, some of you may suffer from PTSD, some of you may be already familiar with PTSD. What I'm really going to do today is explain the difference between post-traumatic stress disorder and other sorts of anxiety disorders or just anxiety in general. I'm also going to give some resources so that you can look up some more things on your own and maybe get some help for some of the things that are PTSD related. We think of PTSD a lot when we're talking about people who have been to war, who have been in combat most particularly, or people who have experienced some kind of a severe trauma, whether it be rape, domestic violence, or some kind of a natural disaster. There are all different kinds of traumas that can cause a person stress. Certainly, when there is a crisis, people with eating disorders tend to go back to their eating disorders to cope or to find something familiar once again. But post-traumatic stress disorder is a type of anxiety disorder. It's not set apart from anxiety in general, and it does often occur after a person has seen or experienced some kind of a traumatic event, whatever that event may be. The traumatic event, as far as the definition for what constitutes post-traumatic stress disorder, has to be something that involved the threat of death or the threat of a severe injury, something that was going to be a threat of harm to a person. Even if harm didn't actually occur, if that threat was there, post-traumatic stress disorder can ensue. There are a lot of different signs of PTSD. Some things are feeling very upset when you are reminded of whatever it was that was the traumatic event. If you have nightmares or very vivid memories, which a lot of people call flashbacks, that's another sign. If you feel very isolated from other people, even when you're around them. If you lose interest in things that you used to care about, sort of like a symptom of depression. If you do actually become depressed, or if you are sort of jumpy, you sort of feel like you're always being threatened or you're always still in danger. You can't really quite let go of that fear, so you're kind of always on edge. If you're feeling very anxious in general, or you have panic attacks, a lot of trouble sleeping, or have a hard time concentrating. Those are all things that can indicate post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, if you only have one of those things, that doesn't mean that you have post-traumatic stress disorder. You actually have to have several of those things. The symptoms actually have to span longer than a month. They have to be going on for a while, and they have to impair your functioning in daily life in order to be considered or attributed to actual PTSD. Research has shown that about half of people that develop PTSD actually recover without treatment. So just because you've ever experienced some level of these symptoms doesn't mean that you are at risk for some kind of extra psychological distress. Many people are very resilient, or they do have healthy coping skills, or they do have the right kinds of supports or genetic factors that do help them to overcome post-traumatic stress disorder. When I'm talking about PTSD, I'm talking about the unfortunate other half that really do need extra treatment and resources in order to overcome this. If more than a month hasn't passed with those symptoms that I've explained, then it's usually deemed that a person has acute stress disorder, which is different than PTSD. An acute stress disorder is basically a kind of shock that is a response to a very terrifying event. And it isn't the same thing as post-traumatic stress disorder, but it is very similar. And really, the main differences between acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder is the duration of the symptoms, how long they last after an event has occurred. The number one thing that I really want to tell you about post-traumatic stress disorder is that early detection of it is very, very helpful in combating it and getting treatment for it. So the longer you live with PTSD symptoms, the harder it probably will be to alleviate them. So if you do notice that you are experiencing some of these things after a traumatic event that you've witnessed or you've experienced, then it really is important to seek help, because there is help available and there is treatment. There's a treatment called EMDR, and it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And it's a very long name, but basically it's a form of psychotherapy, and it puts the client in control. They're the ones that have experienced the traumatic event, and they're the ones that are dealing with all of the ramifications. And it's important for them to sort of be in the driver's seat, because a lot of the time with a trauma, when a therapist or other professional takes the reins, you can almost re-traumatize the person. So it's important to move very slowly, to go at the pace of the client, and to really let them direct things. I think it's really important to note, though, that EMDR doesn't work for everyone. For those it does work, it works really, really well. And it's rather newish as far as treatment options are concerned, so there isn't a ton of research on it yet. There is research out there on it, but not the amount of research that is done on a lot of other different therapies and treatments. So basically with EMDR, you don't want to re-traumatize the person. If you are the client, you don't want to be re-traumatized, and it allows you to sort of process through the distressing event and all of the memories and even the flashbacks at your own pace, very slowly, one memory at a time, and it then can reduce the effects that you feel that sort of re-traumatize you. You target one thing, which could be an issue or an event or some kind of emotion or bad response that you feel, and the client identifies a safe place. You visualize an image, you visualize a memory, you visualize some kind of actual place where you can go to that makes you feel very comforted and comfortable. And that's the safe place that you can go to as you continue to go through the process of bringing up the bad and the traumatic event. I'm explaining it in a nutshell, but it is done along several different phases, several different sessions. So the client focuses on the specific memory that is at hand, and the therapist is sort of guiding the client through the process, but the client is still in control. And by processing through pieces of the trauma one at a time, what the goal is to sort of remove a lot of the negative feelings and anxiety from it and from the client. EMDR usually works really well with specific phobia anxieties. If there's something, a lot of the things that people tend to go to like a hypnotherapist for in order to break themselves of a certain kind of anxiety, EMDR may be very helpful for that. I'm going to provide you with a link to the EMDR Institute, and you can find a whole bunch of great resources there. A lot more of an in-depth explanation as far as what EMDR is and what it can be useful for. The site can also help you find a clinician that practices that, because not all therapists, first of all, know what EMDR is, and even if they do, they're not necessarily trained to practice it. So there is some really good info. I will post the link to their website, and if you're interested, you can check it out. There are certain physical tools that a therapist can use for EMDR, things that click and things that sort of have to do with the eye movement. Behavioral and cognitive therapy can also be really helpful with PTSD. Again, there are several phases to that kind of therapy, and it usually includes work that a client will do on his or her own terms outside of the therapist's office. But you really do re-experience and reassess the trauma. There's a lot of medication that can be helpful with PTSD, and sometimes it needs to be taken long-term. Sometimes it only needs to be taken short-term. So it's really important to see a professional if you do suspect that you have PTSD, or if you know someone who has PTSD, or even if you just want to learn more about it and what can be helpful. In America, the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder has a lot of really good information. Again, a lot of really good public and professional resources that you can check out, so I will post the link to that too. The International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation also has some good resources. PTSD is definitely something that that organization would specialize in, and I believe that you can find access to therapists that specialize in treating PTSD there. Same thing with CBT and similar things. The Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies has a good website where you can use their Find a Therapist service, and it will give you the names of all of the therapists that specialize in CBT, because there, again, are a number of therapists that don't, and if CBT is something that you would like to try, that can really be a good avenue for you. I know that the Timberland Knolls Residential Treatment Center for Eating Disorders also specializes in trauma and PTSD, and they actually have a page devoted to trauma and PTSD on their website, and it goes through talking about addictions and eating disorders and how there's often a dual diagnosis of PTSD with eating disorders when there have been past traumas, and it just gives some information about that. And I think it's really great that they have a page devoted to that, because many people who struggle with an eating disorder have suffered rape, have suffered childhood neglect, have suffered physical abuse or some kind of sexual abuse as a child. There are all different kind of things like domestic violence that are a trauma, or even just the death of a loved one as being a trauma. And certainly more and more now, again, combat exposure is becoming an issue. So there are lots of different things that are affiliated with PTSD, but are also affiliated with eating disorders. And I think it really is important for professionals and even for patients themselves, people themselves struggling, to realize that the two are often very linked. And if you know what to look for, you know that you might need more of a specialized treatment plan or some kind of specialized help or professional to get in there. So I hope if you want more information on PTSD and eating disorders, you will check out the links that I'll put in the info box below this video on YouTube. Hopefully, if you are experiencing signs and symptoms of PTSD, you will reach out, you will get help. There are definitely resources available. It's just a matter of finding them. Take care. Have a great week, everyone. I will see you next time.